he hear? Can everybody hear? Okay. Okay. My name's Bob Nelson. I grew up in Falls City. Those are my parents, Marshall and Connie, as maybe you know. A lot of you were here about a year ago. Yes.
I think it should go closer to you.
Okay.
In the back. Try that.
All right. I'm Bob Nelson. Okay. I'm from Falls City. Okay. And I'll just get quickly through how we came to this place where we were putting together this application for the National Park Service Network to Freedom designation for the Falters building, but that's where the Falters building, that was the site of the Dorrington House and Barn, and that David and Ann Dorrington were moving enslaved peoples through that barn along the Underground Railroad to the north. The problem was we knew that growing up. I'll explain that in a minute, but we needed to prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt and prove what the location was to get over a pretty high bar to get that the Network to Freedom designation. So we could get the plaque, and that can lead to matching federal funds for maybe things in the future for all kinds of educational opportunities and interpretive material that the Park Service can provide. But now I'll step back. I first got into the story because was going out to the Dorrington Revis Toll Mausoleum with my grandmother as a kid, and it was a scary place, and Dave and everybody, the 100 descendants or so of them, know it was kind of a spooky place for a kid to go into, but was always interested in who these people were down there, and particularly as you get down the stairs, front and center, David and Ann Dorrington, and up in the chapel, there's a dedication to them that that mausoleum was built in honor of them by their son. So always was interested in what that was about, what was special about those people. In the 90s, I went into journalism. Actually, my first job was working at the Journal for Bill Shuck, and then went to University of Nebraska, went to Texas for a job, came back to Omaha, went to Phoenix, came back to Omaha for a Metro columnist job. Now we're off around the DC area, but all through that time was always in the back of my head, was in front at some point, was this wanting to tell that story and really collect the level of material that would be needed to, again, kind of prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you could go into a courtroom and prove that they were involved with the Underground Railroad. Because one of the problems with the Dorrington story is that they're not mentioned in any of the national documents related to the Underground Railroad. You have Thaddeus Hyatt, you have George Armstrong, you have a guy named Ira Blanchard who's in the town of Civil Bend. They're all mentioning and they're all writing about each other and their activities together. But although we knew and grown up with Isham Revis's story of the Dorringtons and these other stories, trying to tell a larger national audience or convince what is basically it's a panel of experts in such things that vet the material to join the Network to Freedom. And so we realized pretty early on that we had some real work to do and some more collecting to do, again, to prove that. So anyway, in the 90s, I thought about writing a book about him, started about 30 pages in. I was working with while I was at the World Herald, working with an editor at the University of Nebraska Press, and even then got to a point where it's like page 31 or something. Well, I actually don't know this next. We can't prove that. So this has been something that's been chewing on me for a long time. And at that time, had a second son. All of a sudden, was coaching baseball. Where some of these history things kind of fall in the background when you have to do the life things. And but kept going on. And this came to say last year. Well, one thing I want to say, Bill Rowan has. He's Mr. History in Falls City, and one thing that's kept a lot of us who are expatriates from Falls City connected to our hometown and our hometown story is Bill, and particularly, posting on, I think, memories of growing up in Falls City. It's a site on Facebook. So, say as of 6 years ago, 4 years ago, kind of got hooked into seeing what he was posting or writing about here, and I know that's true for a lot of my classmates and people around the country, around the world who are from Falls City. That's kind of reconnected us, and then also, we all realize this is our home. We feel this is our home. That connection has never stopped, no matter where we are. But so, Bill, thank you again. I think that means more than it does. And this is so. And then last year, I got an email while I was still in Virginia from Dave Kentop, and he's a distant relative who got this same burn going again. And so he was working on this idea of putting a display in the window of the Falters building, now that it was out of private hands, now that it was a nonprofit collection museum. That opened up an opportunity to tell this story in the window. And he got excited about it, and he called and wanted some information. And it was like, oh wow, there's somebody excited about this story that it had always been interested in. And watching his enthusiasm to put the 2 placards in the front, and with Arleta, to go through that process, have that kind of passion to pull something like that off. It kind of, again, you got that fire going again to tell the story again in a way that we can kind of prove it to the to the world, overstating things with that. But anyway, was back here then last spring for quite a while, helping with family and doing some other projects in the Midwest, and had some time to, after getting fired up with Dave and talking to people and to get, like, what can we do with this? And one of the things that is out there is called it's the National Park Service has a program called the Network to Freedom, and there's 700 sites around the country designated as locations of underground activity where people were helping freedom seekers get out of the South. And there's wonderfully heroic stories, and there's all these places back east that were designated. It's like, gosh, Falls City, the Dorrington tale should be on that, as should the 8 other people who were involved with them in helping freedom seekers get out of Kansas, which was a battleground at that point between pro-slavery forces and free state forces after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I'll go into that. But so anyway, I'm going to get to. Sat down, I called a guy who I knew actually, who is now the regional director for the Network to Freedom, Barry Jurgensen, and called the director too back in Delaware with the Harriet Tubman Center. And they said, yeah, here's what you got to do though. That showed what the application process was. And it was pretty daunting. You can come look at it afterwards and we'll post it somewhere. But it's like, but okay, we're going to do this. We can do this. And I, took about a month to get the first copy done, sent it up, and they go, well, this isn't enough. What's the house look like? Their house hasn't been there since 1881. So that became a journey to find the one existing photo of the Dorrington house, which ends up in Dave Kentop's house. So, and Cindy Cupp knows this too, but finding that photo, proving that house sat right on that block that we'd heard the story since I was a child. Oh, it's Falter's building. That's where, we had to, upload documents from the Registrar of Deeds from the 1856 and 1859, books up in the courthouse. So it became quite a journey, kind of a history detective's journey to get to this point where finally they felt our application, the essay telling their story and the story of the Jim Lane Trail, that we had it enough parts put together in the way they needed them, with 10 documents, 60 pages, 20 pages of bibliography with it. It was a pain in the butt, but it was, again, we were driven to do it. So I'm going to read this so that I get the story out to, what you actually are here to hear. So, and this is the site of the Dorrington House and Barn. So, you had to put that on the application. What are you calling this? So, and here it's a tale. And I'll annotate it myself as David and Ann Dorrington's barn, which sat behind their house at what is now 1601 Stone Street in Falls City, Nebraska, Falter's location, was often the first stop in Nebraska for freedom seekers traveling north out of Kansas along the westernmost line of the Underground Railroad, which followed the Jim Lane Trail, the clandestine overland route chartered by Free State leaders hoping to funnel weaponry and immigrants into Kansas in the turbulent first years after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. There's the first footnote. So, and Barry Jurgensen, after reading the first one, he goes, "You're probably going to want a footnote and annotate everything, something proving every paragraph or maybe any sentence that you make a declarative sentence that the board will want you proving from some document, whether it's in the archives of Kansas State Historical Society or Nebraska State Historical Society, or the Lewis Edwards 1917 history, Richardson County history, or the Andreas history from Nebraska, or the Andreas history of Kansas. All these, every one of the things that was in here they had to be able to come check down and see that we had a source for it. So, second paragraph. Sorry, I got to get moving here. So, again, convey information that's useful. The town of Falls City was established by Lane and several other Free State men in the summer of 1857 during the second year of migration into Kansas along the trail. David Dorrington, an experienced carpenter and joiner, moved to Falls City that fall with his wife, Ann, and their youngest child, William, followed in the spring of 1858. That's my great-great-great-grandfather. After finishing the Dorrington House that spring, David built a large barn after he acquired the federal contract to carry the U.S. mail from Falls City to Topeka, a center for Free State and abolitionist activity in Kansas, and one of the primary starting points for freedom seekers embarking from Kansas after being liberated or self-liberated from Missouri and other western slave states. Western as in of the slave states of the time. That'd be Arkansas, Texas. I'm going to get a drink of Pepsi, but... Federal law prohibit something. I'll just stop. They were honestly, there was quite a bit of excitement of this idea that there, somebody in the country. It was done a couple times back east, but we're using the federal mail contract and in the movement of mail to help with, again, enslaved peoples getting out of, again, the contested grounds of Kansas into the less contested grounds of the territory of Nebraska. That's kind of a pretty new story around, because mostly around the country, slaves, if they were fleeing, they were going on their own, heading north, and then finding contacts like that. So there's not many stories like this where there was somebody who had a mail contract, had wagons, horses, and a barn, and they're sending wagons down with mail and coming back in several cases with people who were trying to get out of slavery, and that's so had quite a bit of excitement, and that's fun to see. That gets you pumped up because the national folks and experts in such things identified kind of this new story that they hadn't heard, and so then again we had to prove it. The town of Falls. Okay, federal law prohibited any impedance of the U.S. mail transports, making David Dorrington's mail wagons the ideal conveyance through a landscape teeming with pro-slavery militias and bounty hunters. Once reaching the barn, Ann Dorrington provided food, water, and medical assistance during daylight hours before freedom seekers moved north toward Iowa at night. Sorry, I just had to skip a bunch of footnotes. According to William Dorrington, the Dorringtons' youngest son, John Brown, slept in the barn during the final trip out of Kansas in late January and early February of 1859. So again, we're trying to document the story not only of the Dorringtons' work with the Underground Railroad, but also was John Brown, old John Brown of Osawatomie fame or Harper's Ferry fame, was he really in Falls City as much as people, the rumors were? Well, more than rumors, it was written. You know what, let me stop here because I want to make sure these things have been documented, since and they're in books around the state, different places. And when you're studying this, if you got anybody here wants to have a list of the great reading and the documents that this is based on, there's Isham Revis's Reminiscence of a Wayfarer. David Dorrington Revis wrote in 1934 for the Falls City Journal a whole series of essays about the history of Falls City. A.R. Keim is another writer who told the story of John Brown in Nebraska. And there's actually, there's a lot there, but again, we needed to glue it together in a way that could pass muster. The clearest description, and here's a big deal, the clearest description of the Dorringtons' UGRR activity came from their daughter, Annie Dorrington Revis, who moved in with her parents in the early 1860s at age 18 after finishing school in Elmira, New York, a hotbed of abolitionist activity. In a story about her in the Lincoln Sunday Star in October 1922, she told this story of her family's efforts just before her arrival. Now, Barry and they said, well, you got to get that story up top of your essay because that's the one where you have a primary source. What comes is now like the most important piece of information for them because they want the closest source possible to David and Ann, telling precisely what was being done at that location. And what we don't, David and Ann didn't write about what they did, or we have no documentation of it. Dave Kentop, we were running around everywhere through both family documents and anywhere else we could find anybody who was right there at the time writing about it. They weren't, and one reason we know is because David was doing something very illegal, which was using the federal contract in U.S. mails to assist in what that time was illegal activity. And also, anyway, so there's good reason that they weren't really talking about what they were doing or putting it down on paper. Now later children did and everything like that, but again, first sources are important, and Annie came out of Elmira in 1863, moved in there with them. That's just right after most of the activity of moving enslaved peoples out of Kansas was done, but she's there with her younger brother, with her parents in the house, and in that house she marries Isham Revis a year later, and all these, much of Falls City is born. But this is her story, and this is written, again, in a newspaper, that's written by a professional writer, and this is her being quoted. So this was critical from their eyes that we get that up, and so that the people who don't know our story and who are experts in such things can hear something close to a primary source saying, I've heard my father and mother, and this is her being quoted, I've heard my father and mother and my brother tell many, many times of the slave days. My family felt so sorry for them because they were hunted just like wild animals. Their owners wanted them back dead or alive, and if they did get them alive, they half killed them before they were through with them. These Negroes would stay in the hayloft all day and then would slip away in the dead of night or get through under a wagon load of corn. My father did not dare to go to the barn at all, for he was being watched closely, but my mother, who was one of the bravest women I ever knew, would take hot coffee and bread and butter to those Negroes after, it's an old term, but I'm sorry, to those Negroes after midnight without the slightest bit of light to guide her. There were some pretty narrow escapes sometimes. That's it, but that was important because to have that closest thing to a primary source saying specifically what was happening, and then after that we have all kinds of secondary sources, Isham Revis, this whole group of people telling the story, that now we start backing up both William Dorrington and Ann Dorrington's stories. So this subhead, the Dorringtons in Kansas. This is a story of how they got to this place on the Jim Lane Trail. David Dorrington and his wife Ann emigrated from England in 1842, first settling near Whitesboro, New York, before heading west to Homestead in Kansas. They were British Methodist Episcopals, which if you were a Methodist in England, very anti-slavery. Again, ending up in Elmira, hotbed of abolitionist activity. Anyway, so they're involved, but we don't have documents from Elmira, New York. I called, others have called, nothing saying, yeah, they were all involved. So anyway, in the spring of 1857, David and Ann built a small cabin near Doniphan, a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment and home to the Kansas Crusader of Freedom, an anti-slavery Jim Lane boosting paper edited by Free State militia leader and author James Redpath. This is parenthetical, lots in the new town of Falls City were sold out of the offices of the Crusader of Freedom. So that's what, for all researchers and anybody who gets Jones for this kind of stuff knows, in 2023 and as of the last couple years with newspaperarchives.com and their incredible search engine capabilities, you can type in Dorrington or Falls City, these different things, and whether it's Kansas memory or, it's gotten pretty easy. You can make this sound like it's hard, but if, you pay their monthly fee, which is a little bit much, but anyway, it is a lot easier to dig into papers that haven't existed for 160 years. So, and that's what the Kansas Crusader of Freedom was. It didn't exist, but here I could pull it up and see all these ads for this town, this place called Falls City that didn't yet exist, where they were selling lots, kind of to get money for Jim Lane's next campaign and to keep the Red Pass paper open. But anyway, Dorrington, a carpenter and joiner by trade, was first hired by Lane associate William Brooks. His ads are all over that first paper, the largest advertiser in the Crusader of Freedom, to build a general store west of Doniphan. The Crusader of Freedom was the abolitionist paper of Kansas, I'll say that. After much of the material for its time. After much of the material for the structure was stolen from the site, Brooks instead looked to building the new town of Falls City. And this is just a couple months after it exists as a town. While David was off growing his construction business, Anne stayed back tending to her Kansas cabin and their youngest son, William, the only one of the 6 children who made the initial trip west with them from New York. They're all in school, they come later. In a 1934 series of articles titled Through the Years in Falls City in the Falls City Journal, David Dorrington Revis, Anne's grandson, who later operated a business out of the Dorrington block, that's the building the Falters building and the current collection museum is in. It's way up at the top. It says Dorrington Building, 1881, I believe. Operated a business out of the Dorrington block, described her, quote, first close encounter with the wicked institution of slavery. Now this is Anne talking through descendants, but expanding on a story related in print earlier by Isham Revis and 2 other Dorrington children trying to build the case that this story was told before. Revis wrote that Anne and 12-year-old William were alone in the cabin when, and here's David's quote, a man came hurriedly to the door, nearly exhausted. He told her in a faint way that he was being pursued and asked for protection. She took him and hid him away. In a short time, 2 men approached on horseback and inquired if a fugitive had passed her way. She told them she had seen no one. The men told her she was lying and they were going to search her home. Having a kettle of hot water on the stove, she grabbed it and stood in the doorway, saying she would scald the first man who tried to enter the door. The men hesitated and finally took her at her word. Later, she told the fugitive he must go before night, as she could not be responsible for what might happen. She fed him and he blessed her as she saw him away on the prairie, to what end she never knew. So this is, a key moment for her burn to get him to be involved with the abolitionist movement, but it seems like she was prior to that. Also, as the time they're sitting on the Kansas prairie, Doniphan is right. Maybe town hasn't been there forever. It was washed away by the Missouri River, but it's about 40 miles to the southeast. They're arriving there, coming up the Missouri River right as the Dred Scott decision is being handed down. Judge Taney, this is where they're saying it's saying, African Americans are never going to be, by the Constitution. It was an outrageous document, had the North inflamed, and all this stuff is coming to a head as David and Anne are coming out into Kansas and then into Falls City. A few months later, Anne and William moved to Falls City to spend the winter of 1857 and 1858 with David in an even smaller cabin built on the southeast corner of Block 71. Proved it, documents at the courthouse. It's a fun thing. If you go to the Register of Deeds, go in the back room, the very first books, it's 1856 and 1859. There's even a contract for the creation of the road from Brownville down to Archer. Archer becomes a big part of this story because that town, Archer existed before Falls City, and that's where a lot of Lane Trail activities took place. David Dorrington soon after acquired the contract to transport mail from Rulo, 9 miles to the east on the Missouri River, to Topeka, Kansas via the new town of Falls City. Dorrington acquired horses and wagons from the previous mail carrier, Wellington Northern, as he built a large barn behind their house to the west on lots 13 to 16 of the same block. Again, had to prove what that matched the address, because they've changed the layout of Falls City a couple times from the original plat, so you had to match it all up, send them the 3 different documents as they changed locations to prove that the barn was right there and that it was right behind this house and that house sat there. By the time Dorrington's riders first began transporting mail to Topeka using the Jim Lane Trail, that path via a series of lane towns, there's town Plymouth, right near Sabetha, there was another lane town. As they rolled through, they fortified different areas and started building towns that were free state towns that you could feel safe if you were getting out of Kansas trying to elude pro-slavery militias that you were going to find protection in Lane towns, because these were free state people who had guns, and cannons sometimes. So all of which were stationed here in Falls City just prior to that. Friendly to free staters and abolitionists, already had been used for 2 years by freedom seekers who had been freed or self-liberated from Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas. Now this is the subheading of the Jim Lane Trail, because Falls City doesn't exist if there's not this emigrant train coming to try to avoid Missouri, because Missourians were stopping them, taking their guns, taking everything, and sending them back down the Missouri River, which was the easiest path to get to Kansas. So then they have to regroup and take the long, arduous overland route. And I'll just read to James Lane, a former Indiana congressman and Mexican war hero, moved to Kansas in 1855. The year after, the ill-conceived Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the territories to settlers who would then decide themselves whether their territory would allow slavery. I repeated myself, sorry. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri and other slave states flooded the territory in 1854 and 1855, giving them a majority by the time Lane arrived. Those numbers were artificially bolstered at the polls, perhaps nearly doubled, with rampant ballot stuffing and fraudulent voting. There was an early 1855 census determined Kansas held 2,900 legal voters, and a month later, pro-slavery candidates received about 6,000 votes. So David Atchison, then the senator of Missouri, literally wrote and gave speeches in Missouri after 1854 telling residents or young men from there to go over to Kansas and beat the crud out of any abolition or free staters you see, keep them away from the polls, and then vote. So this was a pretty obvious bad activity. I don't know how to say it. As draconian pro-slavery laws took hold, the Black Laws, quote unquote, passed in 1855 by this pro-slavery Lecompton group, made it a capital crime to aid a freedom seeker, and depredations against abolitionists and free staters increased. Lane's fierce oratory and fiercer retaliatory strikes quickly established him as a leader of the free state cause. After pro-slavery militiamen sacked the abolitionist stronghold of Lawrence in the spring of 1856, Kansas Free State leaders decided to fight fire with fire. Up to that time, mostly in Kansas, it was the New England Immigrant Society. A lot of people imagining they could go in and just settle and there wouldn't be any fighting involved. Well, they found that not to be true. And after enough bad things had happened, they started looking to former generals of the Mexican War and people who could, again, fight back for them. So I'll move down through a bunch of footnotes. Lane is the leading voice of the newly militarized effort, headed back to the Midwest and Northeast to raise money and recruit an army of immigrant soldiers. His speeches through the summer of 1856, vividly detailing the outrages against free state settlers, drew increasingly massive crowds. On May 31st, 1856, Lane, billed as coming, quote, straight from the smoking ruins of Lawrence, gave a thundering 4-hour address. This won't be that long. 4-hour address to 10,000 Free State supporters in Chicago. Huge event in Chicago. That event alone raised $15,000 for the cause, while garnering promises from several hundred young men to, according to the Chicago Tribune, quote, go as settlers and do their duty to freedom on that now consecrated soil. So it was a holy war. It was being described as such. And so all this energy is being built up. 11 days earlier, and this is key to why they stop at the hill that becomes Falls City. 11 days earlier, the federal district court judge for Kansas directed the U.S. Marshal's office to hunt down Lane and 7 other Free State leaders and arrest them for, quote, high treason and levying war against the United States. As of May 1856, Lane and other Free State militia leaders, including his most feared lieutenant, John Brown, could be hanged if captured within the borders of the territory of Kansas. After pro-slavery militia stopped and robbed the first wave of 78 settlers, taking the easiest route to Kansas, the Missouri River through the heart of pro-slavery Missouri, a new overland path was established. Northern settlers under armed escort, and usually armed themselves, took the train to the railroad's westernmost terminus at Iowa City, then traveled by wagon or horseback toward the southwest corner of Iowa near Civil Bend. Doesn't exist. Percival, Iowa, it's down valley. It's flooded like 1,000 times. That's where Civil Bend were. A man named Dr. Ira Blanchard, major abolitionist, lived in that town. He was involved with John Brown. That's where they crossed the river and then had to deal with some of the Nebraska City folks before they could get south. That's a little bit later. After crossing the Missouri River near Nebraska City, well north of the border of the state of Missouri, and that's always the key thing. Missouri is pro-slavery territory. Border ruffians are sitting there and feeling comfortable to be able to strike anywhere very close to the border. So they're doing an end run around the border of Missouri to get to Kansas, into what was pretty untouched virgin territory once you got away from the river towns of Nebraska. 1854 to 1856, you have Omaha, Florence from back in the Mormon Trail days, Bellevue, Peru, Rulo. Then back toward the southwest corner of Iowa near Civil Bend. Sorry, I better keep staring. After crossing the Missouri River near Nebraska City, well north of the border of the state of Missouri, the immigrants traveled due south through Brownville, then on to the now defunct village of Archer on a lightly used wagon road. Instead of continuing, this is a key part that we found and could put this together. Instead of continuing from Archer on the road straight south to Highland, Kansas, though, Lane and his first immigrant train broke out over virgin prairie toward the southwest, hoping to stay clear of federally backed pro-slavery forces. So the scene here is at Archer. It's 2 miles was this town site. There's still a little cemetery up in the trees down on Pony Creek. Would be directly to the northeast. There's a road leading from there in 1856 going straight down into Kansas, close to the Missouri border. What they come to realize as they start showing up in Archer, the immigrants and Lane realize that from their scouts, they learn that the pro-slavery forces is sitting with a large group of troops on that road, the Brownville Road, just over the border in Kansas. And the border means everything because that's as a Kansas governor, pro-slavery governor, he's a federal official, so he can then tell the federal troops based in Leavenworth what to do, and they would have to do it, which was to come up to the border and block free state immigrants from entering, and certainly entering with weaponry. The first group of 500 immigrants set up camp around Archer. About 2 miles southwest of Archer, immigrants increasingly congregated on a high point overlooking the valley of the Big Nemaha River and just beyond the Kansas border. And by the way, when you hear something wrong, tell me, we'll correct it, because there still could be beyond the Kansas border. A cairn, one of the Lane chimneys, as they're called, built to guide immigrants to Kansas, was erected on the highest point of that site, middle of the capital. Capital of Richardson County, the courthouse block. That's where. So if you're sitting down in the river valley, the idea is they're sitting there looking south. Oh crap, we can't go that direction. Oh, let's break up over that hill, toward that to do an end run. And so when they got up here, they built a tower of rocks up on the hill so everybody who was congregating at Archer, as they're moving through there, can see the path toward Kansas, the safer path. The area quickly became a sort of staging area for Lane and his Army of the North is what they're called. Great name, Prior to their advance into territory crawling with pro-slavery militia supported by U.S. troops, that's a key, intent on stopping them. There was the then Governor Geary of Kansas, was a Buchanan appointee who was he was a pro-slavery supporter, so he sent out a general. I'll get to his name. I just lost him. But in the essays in A.T. Andreas' History of the State of Nebraska, Isaac Crook, who the name, street, who owned land on the south side of Muddy Creek Valley, halfway between Falls City and Archer, described the rowdy scene around Archer and the immigrant campsites during the second half of 1856. This is Isaac talking. This is how he's the best primary source establishing what was happening at Archer. Before he comes up to Falls City, builds a hotel. He's all part of our history here in this town. James H. Lane and his men, this is Isaac talking, in 1870s, and his men on their route to central Kansas, where the troubles were commencing between the Free State and Southern men, passed and stopped several times with their arms, ammunition, and artillery. They buried some of their military supplies on Pony Creek, that's an old rumor, south of the later site of Falls City. They purchased from me at good prices 1,000 pounds of bacon, 20 sacks of flour, and a wagon load of apples, which I had brought from Missouri. A week or two before their first arrival, this is a great story, spies came to my house from both sides, reconnoitering, I hate trying to say that word, spying. As they knew I was from Missouri, both northern and southern men wanted to know what I was doing over here, but I gave them evasive answers to their questions. So this is me writing. Crook, whose brother built the first hotel in Falls City 2 years later, Jesse, said he quickly learned how important his guests were to the Free State cause and how feared they were by the slave powers. This is Isaac talking again. As James H. Lane was frequently at my house in my company traveling through the country, and also boarded at a man named Alexander Rickard's house, who comes to Falls City. He's a Lane man, about a quarter mile from mine. I was offered $5,000, which right today is $190,000. I was offered $5,000 by a company of men in Missouri when I was over there purchasing supplies if I would cause Lane's death. I told them I would not kill a man for anything, and they replied that his death would save the lives of thousands of others. So this is a hot time right here, and there's an intense fear, and you read it in the papers, the pro-slavery papers throughout, the territory of Kansas, through Missouri and into the South. Lane's army had, in their minds, become 10,000 troops with the evil John Brown of Osawatomie and so there was this incredible fear of this group. They didn't know quite where they were. They wanted Lane dead. They wanted these people stopped. They had them, the governor had militia, hundreds of troops sitting again directly south. In Lewis Edwards' History of Richardson County, Nebraska, great book, Bill knows this well, and there's a copy of it provided by Marge Laux back in not long ago this is the history of Richardson County. You start gluing stories together, every 80 pages or 100 pages, somebody's telling a reminiscence that starts connecting the story together. About 600 immigrants first crossed into Kansas from the Archer Falls City encampment on August 6, 1856. Now we're building stories out of the Kansas archives. In a 1913 piece on the Lane Trail for Kansas Historical Collections, William Connolly, he's a big figure, a leading Kansas historian and author of Quantrill and the Border Wars, detailed the tense hours after the group rolled out of its Nebraska encampment and pushed into Kansas territory. Connolly drew probably the most detailed map of the Lane Trail in 1913. Is that fair to say? Quote, upon crossing the line, Connolly wrote, great enthusiasm prevailed. The pro-slavery General Smith, Percival Smith was his name, he was the commander of the Western Army, had been checkmated. He had intended to intercept the incoming settlers on what was then known as the Brownville Road, over which they were expected to pass. But the route marked out by the Free State men laid many miles to the west of the Brownville Road and was made through unbroken prairies. Thus the party was able to avoid falling into the hands of the ferocious pro-slavery general. Now, putting that out as an application to them, they're going, well, how do you know the Brownville Road is what, there's a Brownville, Kansas, there's a Brownville, Nebraska. Well, in the archives up there, in the Register of Deeds, there's a contract for the building of the Brownville Road, 1856, from there to Archer, and on that map there's a smaller road leading south of there. And also in Wendell Connolly's map of 1856, and another map, it shows that road coming down into this town of Archer and then leading south toward Highland. Okay, this is a new town is what it's called. I'm sorry. I bounced down there. Lane in disguise and under assumed name crossed first with a small entourage that included John Brown. They then rode hard for Lawrence, where citizens were bracing for another attack from pro-slavery marauders. The bulk of the immigrants went next. Trailing close behind the main immigrant train was a small group of armed men, John Brown Jr. among them, John Brown's son, hauling wagons packed with guns, ammunition, and at least one cannon. They would make the crossing at night after scouts from the emigrant train returned with any information on the location of enemy troops. Going across with a slow group of settlers, that was one thing. It would be hard for anybody encountering them if they didn't have guns, to stop them. So the guns traveled separately at night and made it into where they were needed. There were no permanent structures. On the brow of that hill as Lane, standing next to one of his namesake cairns, delivered a 4th of July address to a crowd of neighbors and immigrants. So, imagine all the buildings gone, tall grass prairie just on this ledge hill here, a tower of rocks, and this wild-haired guy standing there saying, "We're going to make the greatest town in the world here." And to just folks who kind of gathered from around the county, it must have been quite a sight. During his speech, Lane announced that this surrounding area, then just beginning to be platted, would become the industrial powerhouse of the plains, quote, the Lowell of the West, unquote, Massachusetts. As he put it, once a 40-foot tall dam was built across the Big Nemaha River Valley to the south. This guy's a big dreamer. As we know, that didn't happen, but the town was built. Sarah Wilhite Crook, Isaac's daughter, wrote, "I heard Jim Lane give a 4th of July address in Falls City in 1857. John Brown of Harper's Ferry fame was in camp on our land that same year," unquote, put in footnotes. There we have somebody from the time, also confirming, a second source confirming that Lane was here before the town existed, standing there and giving a speech that this was going to be an awesome town. Lane was again in the camp on the hill 2 months later. As a critical October 1857 election neared that would determine if Kansas would be a free or slave state, Lane wrote Brown a letter begging him to quickly transport more guns from Tabor, Iowa, to Kansas to protect voters at the polls. And this is key because we have letters from Jim Lane to John Brown from this town of Falls City that's not even a legal entity yet. Lane again wrote, those are in the Kansas Memory, Kansas State Historical Society records. And if you go online, you can go to kansasmemory.com, go into Bleeding Kansas, a subset of letters. You can start, diving into letters if you so choose. There's only a few thousand, and you can start picking out some of this stuff. Yeah, it's an obsessive compulsive nature here to get into some of this stuff. Oh, and one of these letters is marked by the staff as from Hall City, Nebraska. It wasn't even listed as Falls City, so it made it a little tougher. But anyway, there is no Hall City, Nebraska. That same month, Falls City was mentioned in in pro-slavery Kansas paper, the Kansas Constitutionalist pro-slavery. The story, headlined, quote, "Nebraska Invasion," I love this, claimed 14 men came to Donovan County in Kansas from Falls City, Nebraska on election day and voted, quote, "the Black Republican ticket," which they did so by swearing falsely, unquote. Don't know if it's true. It says, the Democratic Oregon went on to equate the alleged 14 illegal voters from Falls City to the thousands of fraudulent and fake pro-slavery votes during the 2 years prior, trying to equate 6,000 fake votes to 11 maybe, whatever. A pattern of thought set in among pro-slavery editors in Kansas and Nebraska. It was the Free State militiamen based in the border town of Falls City, not pro-slavery Missourians, who were illegally tipping the balance of power in the territory. So, like within the first months this town exists, it's got this fearsome and hated reputation all through, Missouri and the South. I smile about that because it makes me happy that because they were bad people and these were the good guys coming to help out. Government harassment of immigrants at the northern border diminished as Free State proponents took control of territorial government. The Lane Trail, no longer in need of constant alteration to sidestep opposition, became a well-worn road from Falls City to Topeka. As such, it was the perfect route both to move mail south to Topeka, here we go, for David Dorrington, and because of the ribbon of fighting Free State settlers who dispersed along the route from 1856 on, it was the safest route for freedom seekers moving north from the contested territory of Kansas. Within a year of the first immigrant journey on Lane Trail, that path into Kansas through Falls City was also identified by John Brown and other abolitionists as the best path out of Kansas for freedom seekers. Dr. Ira Blanchard, who I mentioned, Civil Bend, a UGRR organizer who lived just across the Missouri River in Civil Bend, Iowa, first suggested the use of Lane Trail for Underground Railroad activities in 1856. It's a letter. John Brown brought Blanchard to Topeka along the Lane Trail that year to help him organize a network of supporters in Topeka who would shelter freedom seekers in their homes while safe passage north was arranged. The trail was first used by this network of abolitionists in February of 1857, just as the Dorringtons arriving in Kansas, just right during the Dred Scott decision, when two network organizers transported 4 people, including a woman named Ann Clark, a freedom seeker held in bondage by a prominent pro-slavery government official in Kansas, in a covered wagon from Topeka to Iowa. So this is the story of the first use of this path, to help freedom seekers. John Armstrong, one of the leading organizers of the Underground Railroad in Kansas, estimated there were nearly 300 other freedom seekers sent north along the Lane Trail. So there we get volume. How many people were moving along this route. The Dorrington, but again, John Armstrong, Ira Blanchard, they don't mention David and Ann Dorrington. But again, we know why now, because they couldn't have their name mentioned, or they might, be arrested. Or the other thing, if you're running businesses in Falls City after the Civil War, which they did, they were wanting to make friends with their former enemies. They wanted to have the railroad come out of Missouri and come through, so it behooved them not to pick fights again or be known to have been involved in illegal activity that they felt in the South was stealing their property. William Dorrington, who was still 12 when he began hauling mail by horse from Falls City to Topeka, offers the only specific reference to John Brown being at the Dorrington House and Barn from someone living there at the time. This is a story I would hear from from my grandmother about her grandfather, William Dorrington, telling about John Brown being in their house. That was exciting as a kid. Like, why? That's how seemed impossibly long ago that I was hearing this story firsthand from my grandmother, from somebody that lived. In the Omaha World Herald in 1925, again, reminiscences told in newspapers of these old timers were critical for this. In the Omaha World Herald in 1925, William Dorrington only quickly referenced a tale he had told friends and family members throughout the 6+ decades prior. Quote, Mr. Dorrington, the unbylined reporter wrote, quote, recalls his first contact with John Brown, the irreconcilable abolitionist who was later hanged at Harper's Ferry, unquote. Dorrington's account of the incident in his father's mail barn suggests a house and barn, which was slightly downhill from the house, were connected by some sort of covered structure with a stairwell. This is back to quoting the story. It was about 1858 or 59. This is William talking. I was with the Pony Mail Service. Again, quote, something quoted from somebody there that's in a document that we can show people. I was with the Pony Mail Service. A partner awakened me early in the morning up in the house. I groped down through the semi-darkness, stepping and stumbling over some object in the way. Arriving downstairs, I was told that the obstacle in my path was John Brown. He was then head of the Underground Railway, which smuggled Negro slaves north. That's an important little document. D.D. Revis, Annie and Isham's son, who was in business with William Dorrington, added this in his series of essays for the Falls City Journal in 1934. Now, again, a secondary source. The, quote, the ruts were deep along which a ghostly procession of covered wagons conveyed Free State men eager to add their bit to the warfare in Kansas and return slaves in false bottom wagons and under the cover of night to Squire Dorrington's barn, where gentle hands fed them and prairie hay became their beds and hideaways. That's beautiful stuff. I mean, very vivid story again. And the wagons are right here out in Stone Street. This straightens out in 57 and 58 as they're building structures. And so the Lane Trail, these folks are coming, here for a couple blocks right here, and just across the street is where the trail headed back down toward the river valley. And there were ruts, right over in that parking lot over there that got paved over, but ruts from the actual the trail heading down there. This is 1910, 1920s, the Toll Brothers talk. He added that John Brown was in Falls City with his gang, unquote, during Brown's last trip out of Kansas in early 1859. Revis then detailed why David Dorrington was uniquely positioned to provide the safest possible transport for fugitives. Well, Wellington Northern got a contract to carry the mail from Rulo to Topeka via Falls City, which Squire Dorrington soon took over with its many horses and built a large barn on lots 13 to 16, block 71, back of his home. They're sending a message, D.D. Revis writing in 1934, this is where this happened. I mean, they're telling us lots 13 and 16, block 71. Thank you. His two boys, John and Will, rode this route on horseback, being enjoined every morning not to take a pony out of the lot that had dried sweat on its hair. They never asked why. They were told that's not true, but knew instinctively that such horses had been on the underground trail the night before and were tired. Many men also carried the mail, but mostly in spring wagons with false bottoms to transport slaves under the protection of the U.S. mails. We know some other names of people who worked with them. They don't show up in the Underground Railroad documents as of yet, but maybe that's something we find in the future. Again, some connection that has the Dorrington operation tied in with some of the other spots along the way. D.D. Revis ended his profile of Anne Dorrington in the Fall City Journal with this, quote, "This fearlessness, this nobleness of character was to display itself often during her many years of life on the frontier, in feeding John Brown's Negroes who slept in her barn, in visiting the sick at all hours, and ministering as midwife in all seasons." So she's also traveling the county with some level of medical skills, helping in other ways. That was her nature. Impact on regional politics in Nebraska's only Lane town. How are we doing on time? Oh my gosh, okay. I'll tell, by late, as I was writing this application, wanted to get it on record and have it vetted, have it pounded out by people who are experts in such things and others, and was passing around to different folks to see how close we could get it to something everybody agreed was correct. Also wanted to tell the story of the early political Black Republican political group here in Fall City, because they were tipping the balance of power against J. Sterling Morton and the Democrats. And I also think that, go guys. By late 1859, just 2 years after the town's founding, Fall City was already notorious in pro-slavery circles as a heavily armed harbor for those freeing slavery, a base camp for Jim Lane, John Brown, and other hawkish leaders of the Free State Militia, and the headquarters of an anti-slavery Republican political machine intent on swaying, allegedly by any means necessary, the balance of power in regional politics. This is where J. Sterling Morton is writing, and how much he hates Fall City, and he's even pulls together a militia to fight the, quote, Jayhawkers of Fall City. The town was so loathed by its enemies, one town founder later joked, it was, quote, a near miracle that pro-slavery ruffians only once visited with intentions, thwarted at gunpoint, to burn it to the ground. That's the story. The leader, now I'm gonna scan it because I'm pushing that hour, and I hear stomachs growling. We have other Underground Railroad inactivity. I'll fire through this. D.D. Revis, like many writers before him and after, likely overstates Brown's involvement with the movement of most enslaved peoples along the Lane Trail in Richardson County. The majority of freedom seekers passing through the area likely did so with assistance of abolitionists other than Brown. Many other after Brown's last appearance in the area. Indeed, Jim Lane himself was arguably responsible for assisting many more freedom seekers than Brown. I had to bring up John Brown over that there's so much. There's the whole Harper's Ferry National Park is centered around the story of John Brown. He's a much larger national figure than Jim Lane. Jim Lane's kind of this lost figure in history, even though to me he's just one of the most fascinating, wild, bipolar, nuts, awesome guy, fighting general, cool guy ever. There's books written about him. As Norma handed me the Jim Lane book as we started out on this process. So again, we're collecting, people were helping so much with the sources to put this together. L.B. Prouty, here's another name, was the editor of the anti-slavery broadax after Sewell Jameson's. Broadax is great reading if you can get to any copy of that. There was this really nasty fight between Sewell Jameson and the Broadax and John Burbank and the Western Reserve in Rouleau. The last time he spent through Richardson County, which was a short time before his Harper's Ferry episode, his companion said that the old man was losing his mind, but that they intended to stick to him to the last, which they did, unquote. The writer in the Andreas history states that Sewell Jamison, the editor of the Broadax in Fall City, came upon two parties who were haggling over the price to be paid for a runaway slave who stood near them, apparently resigned to his fate. While the Indian buck was explaining that while the Indian buck was explaining that for so fat and large a prize, a liberal price should be paid, Jemison captured the bone of contention and sent him off by a special train of the Underground Railway. A colorful writing, but give some details. Who's sending whom where, everything like that. That's how it would have helped us. In 1887 essay, John Brown in Richardson County for the Nebraska State Historical Society, Falls City newspaper A.R. Keim told this tale. When between Falls City and Topeka, a short distance from the later place, Brown captured Squire Dorrington's mail carrier and brought him far enough back toward Nebraska so that before any information could come to the knowledge of U.S. authorities from this source, Brown would be many miles on his way to Falls City and pursuit would be useless. The mail carrier, now a resident of the city, was then an admirer and sympathizer of Brown. This is one of the employees there, besides William and John, who were working for David Dorrington without his knowledge, supposedly. That's a joke. This is the 1859, late January, early February 1859, a trip of John Brown with 12 enslaved people that he had helped free from Missouri, and they killed 2 people in Missouri, and so they were being chased by federal troops, having all kinds of a couple skirmishes in between Topeka on the way to here. And so again, that's been written about. That's a famous event. But again, in the writing about that, the story kind of stops at the Kansas border and begins again at the Iowa border. They have the Iowa Freedom Trail in the state of Iowa, talking about every stop along the Underground Railway from Civil Bend across, and then no mention of what was happening in this frontier territory of Nebraska. And then the story picks up again in Kansas. And that's kind of what this is about. Let's fill in that gap, because it is there. There's a fascinating story to be told. Let's get it, again, vetted and on to, anyway, this is here. I'll get it online, the rest of it. It bored the heck out of 99% of us, I bet, but again, this was an attempt to nail down the Dorrington story, related to the Underground Railroad, prove, that is the location of the house. We could prove that. Prove up and expand this story of the Jim Lane Trail as it related specifically to this spot. Because that's not in the stories in Kansas, that's not in Jim Lane books, that's not put together as the fact of, okay, why was this hill part, why did they break off from, why did the direction of the Lane Trail break so far west, right, from Archer? There's a map of the place, but it doesn't explain. And here, kind of as we put this stuff together, we're able to explain kind of in more detail what was happening there in the middle 1856 and 1857. So I've viewed an hour. Anybody wants to read this, it's here. We'll get it online. But that's the heart of it. The idea, collecting all that, writing it, I sent it. The first copy to Barry Jurgensen, Diane Miller, who was the regional director. I thought I got everything. I was like, this is. They go, it set line of notes down the side of it in Word, saying, no, how do we know this for sure? Can you get more footnoting on this paragraph? And Barry's like, you probably want to footnote and reference, some source for every sentence you have in this. So, interesting volunteer effort here, but we did it, and I at this whole time I'm, Dave Kentop at the same time is running. He's got the same burn, and so his wife Arlita to tell this story. So he's coming with things he's found, and again, back to the very start of this, as I'm trying to sell this story to the federal officials. Where's the picture of the house? Oh, you got it. Okay, well this is fine. This image is this tall, and it came from I think it was Beppy B's book. Is that Cindy? Is that, yeah? And then Dave had it. I'm not sure exactly, but it's like, oh Dave, God, so we've got to find a photo. We have this house, this place that hasn't existed for 140 some years. And nothing ran down normal. We're trying to find this photo of the Dorrington House and Barn. It's just not there. It's not. They went up with a couple of the guys with a couple of the folks with the State Historical Society went through everything they had, went through just photos from 1870 from southeast Nebraska, tintypes. Weren't coming up with anything. But Dave went back through that scrapbook that FUB had put together, and in one corner of one page, I believe it's about 2 inches tall, the actual... Oh, wait, okay. Arlita found it.
Well, I had my glasses on and he didn't.
There we go. Talk to her.
It looks like a house, and he goes, let me see your glasses.
Got it.
Because it's just
Yeah.
that big.
Yeah, he sent and so what it is, it's a house, and you can barely see. Here are two women standing there, and over here that's not is writing. It doesn't say this is David and Ann Dorrington's house. Make sure I get this story right. It says what Grandma was married here in 1864, and what. Of course, that all triangulates as to Annie Dorrington's marriage to Isham Revis, which we have documented was in 1854 within the original David and Ann Dorrington house. So, and we sent that off to, the national director to say, hey, does this pass? We can prove, doop, 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 doop. And they go, yeah, that stands by their standards. We believe it. It's just basically begging them. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? Yes, we believe it. So, that was just that's the most history detectives kind of hunt and find. Now, this is for anybody here. If you happen to see in family, wherever, anywhere around the world, a picture of a tintype that looks like it's from the 1870s, and it's maybe from Falls City, and there's a barn in the background. That's what we're not. There's no photo anywhere that says the Dorrington Barn. So that's one of your assignments here over the next couple of years is to find a picture of that barn. It may be in the background of some picture of a couple people standing there. That's what we're looking for. Didn't find it. At some point had to do some other things and had to get this done. We did have a deadline of July. So anyway, that got that all put together. I had Barry Jurgensen, who then became the regional director for the network to Freedom Base in Omaha, the Omaha office, and Diane Miller had them both read the application prior, so kind of we knew we had the fix was in. And they're saying, yeah, this is it. I'm sure our people, the group that's going to see it, is going to be okay with that. Months passed. This is how they say the government works, and got the notification that it had been accepted. And hey, cool, it's the only one west of the Mississippi, and as Barry noted, it's kind of a neat deal. It's only there are a lot of grave sites marked as under Network to Freedom, and that's kind of honestly, that's the easy stuff. Somebody, but this was the double backflip of getting on the Network to Freedom registry. But it is besides the Mayhew cabin, only the second site in Nebraska designated by the Network to Freedom as a site of actual Underground Railroad activity. Mayhew cabin, the Dorrington site. So we've got two of them now. Now, the assignment for the next year too. A mausoleum could be one, and here's the what would be super cool, and they say it's tougher than heck, is you can get a designation for an area or a district, as they call it, meaning it would be cool. At Falls City, we've got Elmer Dundee, Isham Revis saying, and others, the Dorringtons, Elmer Dundee, who makes the 1879 ruling, standing bear case. That Elmer Dundee is here. He's an abolitionist, Falls City in 1858 to 1860. But 7-8 people were involved besides William Buchanan north of town, Fred Dorrington in a little house right here. And that's kind of a plum. It's like these are trophies to be grabbed. But if Falls City could be designated, which it should be, as a district of activity, because this is a town that was built precise, to fight slavery, and not everybody here was fighting slavery. You had free staters who just wanted a nice piece of land, whatever. But the real abolitionists here at the core of this town was built on a great idea and wanted to go fight for it, and that's. We know now through the State Historical Society and this federal group that this is a story they're interested in hearing. I'm rewriting this right now for the state magazine, and just reconfiguring it in a way that reads as a magazine story, so we can get the story in the state, discussion, and then hopefully, as time allows and schedules allow, and we can start piecing together even more details, like what were Dorrington, their helpers, who are they actually working with in Plymouth and beyond? What was the network? How was that put together? That'd be a great thing to know. We just couldn't find, there's a lot of stuff we just couldn't find, but dang it, we got that done. And now what that means is that, and Susan Sippel's been incredibly helpful as a, director of the nonprofit board, the Collection Museum. Now we've jumped this bar, we've got the plaque, and they had the plaque ceremony. That's a whole different story. Trying to get that plaque made with Dave from across the country to Network to Freedom standards by the date to have it, the event here in Fall City on November 25th, but not for another day. But now this opens up that site we need to get. For Susan, she's tasked me with that, is getting more information to the building. So because people are coming in going, hey, we read about this thing. We want more information. So we need to get the application document turned into something that people can read if they're so interested as they walk through the door. And there are people interested in this. There's around the east. There's all kinds of freedom trails up and down through. Running north to south, east and west, and if it was wanted, we could be a part of that. I just got a call this morning from the Iowa Freedom and Trail director. That was asking them, well, what would it take to start combining something Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska? And that's something now Barry Jurgensen, who's now the regional director for the Network to Freedom, he's going to work on. How can people follow through Iowa, come through Nebraska, learn this story, and move on toward Topeka and Lawrence? And again, also, I was put on task by Susan, what federal grants are out there, federal matching grants for interpretive material to be in that structure. Susan has an idea of a staircase, down. Neat ideas, murals on it. More work with Fall City High School and Sacred Heart history students, having them get involved with researching, and just learning the process of how you research something to prove it to people who know the story well, who are experts in such things. So there's just so many opportunities that it seemed like this could open up if working together to turn it into something a little bigger and better. But I am way past. Let's go eat. If you have any questions, any questions real quick, or should we close it down? Who wants to shut it down now? Anybody who wants to leave, just go. Any questions? If you guys want to stay around, I'm happy to, if I can have a drink of Pepsi. Thank you.
I'm just wondering if you had found anything about Miles Ranch, because they're male
Right,
and
of national stature, yeah.
I thought they got established in 1857 as well.
1857, right, yeah, and they're the part of the mail, Dorrington Mail run was to link up with the Overland Trail than to Miles's people moving west. So they are connected. Of course, the Dorrington Barn this was an idea because Miles Ranch in the western, was that fair to say, western part of Richardson County, was a major part of the Overland Trail Road. That was a big national deal. Dorrington's operation was much smaller. It's a mail route. It's not the Pony Express. It's not the Overland. But since we don't have any image of the barn, we don't really have a specific description except for the corn cribs, except for saying in the haylight. That we thought, just for one thought in my head, was that barn that's out there is at least something of an example of what a mail barn might look like. But what was your question to begin with? There's a connect, yeah.
Routes connect.
They connected in that the Lane Trail, their mail routes heading down towards Sabetha, and that would have been intersecting then with the Overland Trail route coming toward toward the corner of Richardson County. So they were running mail, Rulo riding the ponies, the 12-year-olds and 14-year-old William and John Dorrington are, riding their horses through virgin prairie to get to the overland. I don't know where the stage stop was or the stop was, but they were also taking mail, I know, to connect. Because there is this story about them meeting up with Buffalo Bill Cody, right? That's a story of John Dorrington's in Arizona. Who knows if it's true? The guy told some wild stories. But anyway, yeah, there is a connection, and maybe the barn. I called them. I called them out at the Miles Ranch to see if they had any photos of other, 1860s mail barns in the. It's just you keep hunting, but. Some 90% of things lead to dead ends, all kinds of rabbit holes. But a couple of them, we have a picture of the house. We have the plaque. See, adios, sir. Any other questions?
Yes. What about the underground tunnels?
No, and if you. 1857, 1858, they're just getting to the surface of building. David Dorrington's coming up. They're building houses. They're focused on that. I think there's some confusion because just literally the name Underground Railroad leads people to think of tunnels. John Brown's Cave, that's not where they were, but it kind of fit the Underground Railroad terminology. So that happens all across the country. This is why we have to prove so much, because there's a lot of myth and legend across this region between the North and the South about in the generations after everybody kind of wanted to be, hey, we have abolition. We were part of the good fight. Not all of them are true. Some are hyperbole. Some are myth and legend. But they might have been running booze. I would think underneath that made a lot more sense. But there wouldn't have been tunnels. They wouldn't have been digging tunnels because they didn't have to. They came up to the barn. They were busy building structures and trying to win elections and everything else. They didn't need tunnels because, too, everybody had guns. Fugitive slave hunters didn't want to come up to this hill. John Brown and his crew just apparently rode right through town. Nobody was accosting them because this was a lane town. This was a safe place with abolitionists. So even though we know David was being watched, there were people and there were spies checking on what they were doing. This was a pretty safe space if you were coming through, trying to get out of slavery. There's stories, and that's down in there, and there's more stories of fugitive slave hunters actually coming into the town and being run off. So, it's just, I think, again, underground tunnels, underground railway, it's sort of taking literally a metaphor or, sort of description of something that was covert. That's all I know, but if there's proof, it existed, but we haven't found that. Is that, Bill, you know so much. Have you ever, yeah. Any other questions or? Well, let's adjourn this thing. And if you have any questions, I can stay around. Oh, you can. Good. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for all the hand talking and that, but I really appreciate it. And thank you. Hope that was fun and useful. Oh, and here's a copy of the application documents and everything if you want to look at those too. She has. And we'll get it online too in some way that the story can be. Hi, thank you. How are you doing? Hi, I'm gonna.
Good. How are you?
I'm just worn out and talk too much, and I'm gonna go turn that thing off here. Hi, how are you doing, bro?
How you doing?
It's great to see you.
Looks like you've been doing a little pumping iron.
I have to. I got that weird autoimmune disease that if I don't exercise, I'm a cripple. So I'm either got to be jacked or,
You look good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, all right. Well, we'll wrestle here. I'm going to grab this real quick.
Getting your pants.
Maybe. Let's